Have you ever heard of a single piece of pottery changing the face of an entire continent? It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but it's a very real chapter of our human story. Today, we're diving deep into the world of the Bell-Beaker people, a mysterious group who, around 4,800 years ago, emerged and spread across Europe, leaving a legacy that's still being uncovered. Their name comes from their most iconic creation, a distinctive upside-down bell-shaped pot. But these weren't just ordinary kitchen vessels. They were symbols of status, identity, and a whole new way of life that would ripple from Iberia to the British Isles and all the way to Central Europe. So, who were these people? For a long time, archaeologists debated whether the Bell-Beaker phenomenon was just a trendy new style that caught on a cultural package of ideas and objects that spread from person to person, or if it represented the actual movement of people. Was it a fashion fad or a full-blown migration? Thanks to the incredible advances in ancient DNA analysis, we now have a much clearer picture. And let me tell you, the answer is far more dramatic and complex than we ever imagined. In some places it was a cultural exchange, but in others it was a massive demographic shift, a wave of newcomers who didn't just bring new pots. They brought new genes, new languages, and new traditions that would redefine Europe forever. Let's start with the pot itself. Imagine you're at a feast almost 5,000 years ago. The fire is crackling, and the air is filled with the smell of roasting meat and brewing ale. Someone of high importance arrives, and they aren't carrying a crown or a scepter. Instead, they're holding a beautifully decorated ceramic beaker. It's reddish-brown, intricately incised with geometric patterns and shaped like a bell. This isn't just for drinking. It's a statement. Owning a Bell-Beaker meant you were part of an exclusive, well-connected network. These pots were often found in the graves of important individuals, buried alongside other prestige items like copper daggers, gold ornaments, and finely crafted archers' equipment. This beaker package suggests a warrior elite class, individuals who valued personal prowess, long-distance trade, and ritual display. The beakers themselves may have been used for consuming a special beverage, perhaps an early form of beer or mead, during important social ceremonies and rituals that bonded communities and forged alliances. The story begins around 2800 BCE in the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal. The earliest beaker pots appear here, and for a while, it seemed like this was the hearth from which all other beakers originated. However, the plot thickens. As we trace their path, we see the style rapidly appearing all over Western and Central Europe. How did it spread so fast? This is where the genetics come in. When scientists analyzed the DNA from ancient skeletons buried in beaker graves, they made a startling discovery. In Britain, for example, the arrival of the beaker culture coincided with a near-total population replacement. Around 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool, the descendants of the people who built Stonehenge, was replaced within a few hundred years by newcomers from the continent. These weren't just a few travelers. This was a massive migration that fundamentally changed the genetic makeup of the British Isles. Think about that for a second. The people who built one of the world's most iconic ancient monuments were largely replaced by a new group who brought with them these distinctive pots. The newcomers had ancestry tracing back to the steppes of Eastern Europe, the same source population that had spread across the continent centuries earlier. They brought with them not just beaker pottery, but also knowledge of metalworking, new farming techniques, and likely an early form of Indo-European language, the ancestor of most languages spoken in Europe today. But the story is different elsewhere. In places like France and Iberia, the genetic impact was less dramatic. Here, it seems the beaker lifestyle was adopted by local populations. It was a cultural exchange, where local elites embraced the new status symbols and rituals to enhance their own power and prestige, without a massive influx of new people. So, we have a fascinatingly mixed picture. In some regions, the Bell-Beaker phenomenon was driven by migration, with people physically moving and settling in new lands. In others, it was driven by cultural transmission, with ideas and objects moving faster than the people themselves. Why the difference? It likely depended on the local context. In areas with low population density or social instability, newcomers might have found it easy to establish themselves. In more densely populated and stable regions, locals might have simply adopted the parts of the beaker culture that they found appealing. This highlights a crucial point in archaeology. A single explanation rarely fits the entire picture. Human history is messy, complex, and wonderfully diverse. The Bell-Beaker people weren't a monolithic empire or a single ethnic group. They were a network of interconnected societies, sharing a set of powerful ideas and symbols. What were these ideas? At its core, the Beaker ideology seems to have emphasized the individual. Unlike the earlier Neolithic period, which often focused on massive communal monuments like long barrows and causewayed enclosures, Beaker burials are typically single graves. The focus is on the deceased individual and their personal wealth and status, showcased by the grave goods they were buried with. This new focus on individual identity and martial prowess, represented by the archer's gear and daggers, signaled a major social shift across Europe. It was the dawn of the Bronze Age, a time of increasing social stratification, long-distance trade in metals, and the rise of powerful chieftains and warrior elites. The Bell-Beaker wasn't just a pot. It was the symbol of a new world order. So, what happened to them? The Bell-Beaker period eventually fades around 1800 BCE, transitioning into the full-blown Bronze Age cultures that followed. But their legacy was profound and lasting. Genetically, they formed the bedrock for many subsequent European populations. The DNA of these Beaker migrants is still a major component in the genes of people in Britain, the Netherlands, and Central Europe today. Culturally, they helped to knit Europe together into a more interconnected continent, spreading technologies like metalworking and ideas about social structure and ritual. They effectively laid the groundwork for the societies that would later become the Celts, the Germans, and others. They were a people on the move, defined not by borders but by a shared culture symbolized by a simple yet powerful ceramic pot. The story of the Bell-Beakers is a perfect example of how archaeology is a constantly evolving field. What was once a debate about pots versus people has become a nuanced story of both, illuminated by the incredible power of ancient DNA. It reminds us that our past is not a simple, linear story but a tangled web of migration, interaction, and transformation. The next time you see an ancient pot in a museum, remember the Bell-Beaker. It might not just be a piece of pottery. It might be the calling card of a people who arrived, feasted, and forever changed the destiny of a continent. Ever wondered how a simple cup could change the world? Today, we're diving deep into the story of the Bell-Beaker people, a culture that swept across Europe over 4,000 years ago, not with armies, but with something far more intoxicating: parties. Imagine this: you're living in Neolithic Europe. Life is local, your world is small. Then one day, strangers arrive. They don't look like invaders. They carry stunningly crafted, bell-shaped pots, and they invite you to a feast. This wasn't just a casual get-together. This was the engine of a cultural revolution. Archaeologists have long been fascinated by the rapid spread of the Bell-Beaker phenomenon, from Iberia to Britain and all the way to Central Europe. For a long time, we debated whether it was people moving or just ideas. Thanks to ancient DNA, we now know it was both. But what made their culture so appealing? The answer lies in what was inside those beakers. Scientists have analyzed the residue left inside these ancient pots, and they found clear evidence of something special: alcoholic beverages. We're talking about early forms of beer, mead made from honey, or even wines. These weren't just for quenching thirst. These drinks were a social lubricant, a ritual substance that brought people together. Think about the power of hosting a great feast. You provide exotic drinks, delicious food, and a space for people to connect. In a world without written contracts, these gatherings were where alliances were forged, trade deals were struck, and marriages were arranged. The host, the one who could afford to throw such a lavish event, gained immense social status. They became the center of a new, expanding network. The beakers themselves were status symbols. They were beautifully decorated, often with intricate geometric patterns. Owning one, and more importantly, being able to fill it with a potent brew, was a sign of wealth and influence. It was like showing up to a party today with a vintage bottle of champagne. These weren't everyday pottery. They were the chalices of a new elite. The act of drinking together from these special vessels created a shared experience, a bond. It was a ritual that could turn strangers into allies. Participants in these feasts became part of a prestigious, interconnected club. Adopting the beaker package, the pot, the drink. The ritual was a way to buy into this new social order and access its benefits, like new technologies, trade goods, and a wider network of support. This social strategy was incredibly effective. Instead of conquering their neighbors, the beaker people integrated them, They offered a more attractive, sophisticated lifestyle and people eagerly adopted it. This explains how their cultural traits, and as we now know their DNA, spread so quickly and so far. But it wasn't just about parties. The Beaker culture also had a very specific way of honoring their dead, which tells us even more about their society. When we look at their graves, a fascinating pattern emerges. Men and women were buried with distinct sets of grave goods, reflecting a society with clearly defined gender roles. Typically, men were buried with daggers, arrowheads, and archery equipment, like stone wrist guards. These items point to roles as hunters, warriors, or protectors. They were often laid to rest on their left side facing east. Women, on the other hand, were buried with different items, such as pottery, bone points or awls, which might have been used for leatherworking or textiles, and occasionally small copper ornaments. They were placed on their right side, facing west. It's as if they were positioned to face each other in the afterlife, a symbolic representation of their complementary roles in life. And, of course, many of these graves, for both men and women, contain the iconic Bell-Beaker itself. Placing this vessel in the grave suggests a belief that its social and ritual importance extended beyond life. It was a passport to the afterlife, a symbol of the individual's identity and status within the Beaker world. This standardized funerary practice, repeated across thousands of kilometers, highlights the strength of the Beaker cultural network. It shows that people from Scotland to Sicily shared a common set of beliefs about life, death, and social order. You could travel hundreds of miles, meet another group of people, and immediately understand their social structure and values just by observing their rituals. This shared ideology, centered on the ritual of feasting and reinforced in their burial customs, was the glue that held their vast network together. It allowed for the smooth flow of goods, ideas, and people across the continent. They created a kind of prehistoric common market or social media network, but instead of smartphones, they had beakers. The expansion wasn't always peaceful, of course. The presence of weapons in male graves tells us that conflict was a reality. The emergence of a new elite can create tension. But the primary driver of the Beaker phenomenon seems to have been social and cultural, not military. They offered a new, aspirational identity. Think about the legacy. The arrival of Beaker people in places like Britain was transformative. Genetic studies show that within a few hundred years, they had almost completely replaced the existing population, the people who built Stonehenge. This wasn't a violent conquest in the traditional sense, but a demographic shift driven by the advantages that the Beaker lifestyle offered. They were more mobile, had wider networks, and likely had social structures that allowed for more rapid growth and expansion. So the next time you share a drink with friends, think of the Bell-Beaker people. They understood over 4 millennia ago the profound power of coming together, of sharing a special beverage from a special cup. They used feasting not just for fun but as a strategic tool to build alliances, display power, and create a cultural network that reshaped a continent. That simple, elegant bell-shaped pot wasn't just a piece of pottery. It was a key to a new social world, a symbol of status and connection, and the catalyst for one of the most significant cultural transformations in European prehistory. It proves that sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start on the battlefield, but around the feast. Ever wondered how a simple cup could signal a massive technological revolution across Europe? It sounds strange, right? But that's exactly what happened around 4,500 years ago with the Bell-Beaker culture. These people weren't just known for their distinctive, bell-shaped pottery. They were pioneers, carrying with them a set of innovations that would fundamentally change the course of European history. Today, we're diving deep into the world of the Bell-Beaker phenomenon, exploring how their mastery of copper and archery gave them an unparalleled technological edge. This isn't just a story about pots and pans. It's a story about power, status, and the very foundations of modern European society. So grab your virtual toolkit, and let's journey back to the dawn of the Bronze Age. The story begins with a reddish, malleable metal, copper. While copper had been used before, the Bell-Beaker people took its production to a whole new level. Across Europe, from Iberia to the British Isles and all the way to Central Europe, we see an explosion in copper metallurgy associated with their arrival. They weren't just finding surface-level nuggets. They were mining. They developed sophisticated techniques to extract copper ore from the ground, smelt it in furnaces, and cast it into a variety of new and powerful tools. This was a game changer. Suddenly, you had daggers that were sharper and more durable than anything made of stone. You had awls for intricate leatherworking and axes that could clear forests with greater efficiency. This wasn't just a minor upgrade. It was a quantum leap in technology. The control of copper resources and the knowledge of how to work it became a major source of power. Communities with access to copper mines or skilled metalworkers held a distinct advantage over their neighbors. Now, let's talk about the second piece of their technological toolkit, archery. When we find Bell-Beaker burials, we often find a very specific set of items buried with high-status individuals, particularly men. Alongside their iconic beakers and new copper daggers, we frequently discover a stone wrist guard, also called a bracer, and a number of flint arrowheads. This isn't a coincidence. This was the archer's package. The wrist guard protected the archer's arm from the snap of the bowstring, a clear sign of a practicing archer. The arrowheads, often beautifully crafted, were the business end of a deadly weapon. The bow itself, usually made of wood like yew, rarely survives in the archaeological record, but the presence of the other equipment is undeniable proof of its importance. Archery became more than just a way to hunt. It became a symbol of a new warrior identity. A skilled archer was a formidable force on the battlefield and a valuable protector of the community. Owning a high-quality archery set, complete with a polished stone wrist guard and a copper dagger, was the equivalent of driving a luxury sports car today. It broadcasted your status, your skill, and your power to everyone around you. So you have copper metallurgy and advanced archery. What happens when you combine them? You get a powerful recipe for social change. The production of copper tools and weapons couldn't be done by just anyone. It required specialized knowledge, access to resources, and a significant investment of time and labor. This led to the rise of specialists: miners, smelters, and smiths. These weren't just craftspeople. They were the tech gurus of their day, holding the keys to the most advanced technology available. This specialization naturally created new social structures. Those who controlled the production and distribution of copper goods gained immense wealth and influence. For the first time, we see a significant accumulation of personal wealth in the form of metal objects. Burials from this period show a growing disparity. Some graves are filled with copper daggers, gold ornaments, and elaborate pottery, while others have very little. This is the archaeological signature of a social hierarchy taking root. A new elite class was emerging, their power built on the foundation of this new metallurgical technology. They weren't just chiefs in name. They were chiefs because they controlled the means of production and the most advanced weaponry. This technological shift didn't just change social structures. It fundamentally altered how people interacted with each other. Conflict and negotiation took on new dimensions. Before the widespread use of metal, conflicts might have been more ritualized or fought with less deadly weapons like stone clubs and axes. But a copper dagger is a personal lethal weapon designed for close-quarters combat. An arrow from a powerful bow can kill from a distance. The stakes of any conflict were suddenly raised. This new weaponry likely changed the nature of warfare. Raids for resources, like cattle or control of metal-rich territories, may have become more common and more deadly. The image of the archer warrior became a powerful symbol of this new reality. However, technology isn't just about fighting. It's also about negotiation. The ability to produce or trade for these valuable metal items became a powerful diplomatic tool. Alliances could be forged by gifting a finely crafted dagger. Fealty could be sworn over a shared beaker of mead or beer. The Bell-Beaker package of pottery, daggers, and archery equipment became a shared cultural language across a vast area of Europe. It was a way for different groups to connect, trade, and negotiate their place in a rapidly changing world. The beaker itself might have been used in social rituals, cementing bonds and alliances. So this technology wasn't just a destructive force. It was also a constructive one, helping to build new, complex social networks that spanned the continent. So, what is the ultimate legacy of the Bell-Beaker technological edge? It's nothing short of transformative. They laid the groundwork for the European Bronze Age. Their expansion spread the knowledge of copper metallurgy far and wide, creating an interconnected world hungry for metal. This demand spurred exploration, trade, and even more technological innovation, eventually leading to the discovery of bronze, the alloy of copper and tin, which was even stronger and more versatile. The social hierarchies that began to form during the Bell-Beaker period would continue to develop, leading to the rise of powerful chiefdoms and eventually the first kingdoms of Bronze Age Europe. The warrior identity, symbolized by the archer and the dagger, became a central tenet of elite culture for centuries to come. The dynamics of conflict and diplomacy, shaped by these new technologies, set a precedent for how European societies would interact for millennia. When we look at a Bell-Beaker pot in a museum, we're not just looking at a piece of pottery. We're looking at a symbol of a revolution. A revolution powered by copper, fletched with arrows, and driven by people who, through their technological ingenuity, reshaped a continent and set it on a new path. They were the pioneers, the innovators, the ones who bridged the Stone and Bronze Ages, and their influence is still felt in the very foundations of the world we live in today. Have you ever wondered where the people of Europe actually came from? For a long time, we thought of ancient societies as static, rooted in one place for millennia. But what if I told you about a time around 4,500 years ago, when a massive wave of change swept across the continent, forever altering its genetic and cultural landscape? This wasn't an invading army in the way we might think of one. This was the era of the Bell-Beaker people. So what exactly is a Bell-Beaker? It's a distinctive style of pottery, shaped like an upside-down bell. Archaeologists started finding these pots all over Europe, from Spain to Poland, from Italy to Britain. For decades, the big question was, did this pottery style spread like a viral meme, an idea passed from one group to another? Or was it carried by actual people on the move? This was the classic pots versus people debate. For a long time, the evidence was ambiguous. We saw the pots, we saw the associated artifacts, things like copper daggers, archers' wrist guards, and specific burial rituals. But linking that to a large-scale migration was difficult. It seemed more likely that it was a fashionable cultural package, a status symbol adopted by local elites across Europe who wanted to show they were connected and powerful. But then, a scientific revolution happened. Ancient DNA. Suddenly, we could look directly into the past, not just at the objects people left behind, but at their very genetic code. And what it revealed was staggering. The story of the Bell-Beakers wasn't just about pots. It was very much about people. Let's start in Iberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal. This is where the earliest Bell-Beakers appeared, around 2800 BCE. The genetic evidence from this region shows that the beaker culture initially spread without a major movement of people. The local farmers, who had been there for thousands of years, simply adopted this new pottery style. So in the beginning, it really was just an idea spreading. But that was only the first chapter of the story. A few centuries later, something dramatic happened in Central Europe. A new group of people, genetically distinct from the Iberians, also adopted the Bell-Beaker culture. These Central Europeans had a significant amount of ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands. North of the Black Sea, these were the descendants of the Yamnaya people, horse-riding pastoralists who had already begun expanding westward. When this steppe ancestry group adopted the Bell-Beaker package, they supercharged it. They didn't just adopt the pots. They merged it with their own traditions and then began a massive expansion of their own. This wasn't a slow trickle of people. This was a wave. And as they moved west, they took their genes with them. The most dramatic evidence of this comes from Britain. Before the Beakers arrived, Britain was inhabited by the descendants of the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments. Around 2400 BCE, people carrying the Bell-Beaker culture and steppe-related DNA crossed the channel. Within a few hundred years, they had almost completely replaced the existing population. Think about that for a moment. Genetic studies show that after the Beaker arrival, about 90% of the gene pool in Britain was replaced. This is one of the most significant and rapid population turnovers in European prehistory. The people who built Stonehenge didn't just disappear, but their genetic lineage was almost entirely overwritten by these newcomers. It was a demographic transformation on an epic scale. So how did this happen? It probably wasn't a single, violent invasion. It was more likely a process of migration and integration that spanned generations. The newcomers may have had advantages, perhaps new technologies, a different social structure, or even diseases to which the local population had no immunity, a bit like what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a fundamental change in the island's identity. A similar, though slightly less extreme, story unfolded across other parts of Europe. In places like Germany and the Czech Republic, the arrival of the Bell-Beaker people also brought a major shift in ancestry, with steppe DNA becoming dominant. In other areas, like France, the process was more of a mix. The newcomers and the locals intermarried, creating a hybrid population. This reveals something crucial about the Bell-Beaker phenomenon. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all event. In some places it was an idea. In others, it was a massive migration. And in many places, it was something in between, a complex process of interaction and hybridization. The pot itself became a symbol of a new, interconnected Bronze Age world, but the people carrying it were diverse. This also forces us to rethink what we mean by culture and identity in prehistory. The Bell-Beaker phenomenon wasn't a monolithic culture or a single ethnic group. It was more like a social network or a shared ideology that connected different peoples across a vast continent. Being a beaker person might have been about signaling your membership in this exclusive club, a club that gave you access to trade, technology, and social status. The genetic evidence shows us that this identity was fluid. A person in Iberia making a Bell-Beaker pot was genetically very different from a person in Britain making a very similar pot a few centuries later. The culture spread, and the people spread, but they didn't always spread together or in the same way. What's also fascinating is how this genetic shift laid the foundations for modern Europe. The steppe ancestry introduced by the Yamnaya and spread by the Bell-Beaker people is a major component of the DNA of most modern Europeans today. They also brought with them the Indo-European languages, which would eventually evolve into Celtic, Germanic, Italic, and Slavic languages spoken across the continent. In a very real way, the events of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age are still with us, written in our DNA and spoken in our languages. So the next time you see a picture of one of these elegant bell-shaped pots in a museum, remember the epic story it represents. It's not just a piece of pottery. It's a symbol of a pivotal moment in human history, a story of migration, replacement, and transformation. It is a story of how a cultural fashion item became linked with one of the greatest genetic shifts in Europe's past, creating the hybrid societies that would become the foundation of the continent we know today. The pots versus people debate has been solved, and the answer, wonderfully, is both. Have you ever wondered what makes us human? Is it our DNA, our language, our tools? Or is it something more intangible? Today, we're diving deep into the past, over 4,500 years ago, to uncover a mystery that might just hold the answer. We're talking about the Bell-Beaker culture. Imagine a time long before nations, before written history, a time when Europe was a mosaic of diverse local tribes. Suddenly, a new and distinctive style appears, seemingly out of nowhere, and sweeps across the continent, from Spain to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily. This isn't an empire built by conquest, but a cultural phenomenon defined by a very specific object, a beautifully decorated bell-shaped ceramic pot. The beaker. Who were these people? For a long time, archaeologists thought they were a single group of migrants, a beaker people who replaced existing populations. But the story, as we're now discovering, is far more complex and fascinating. It turns out, the Bell-Beaker phenomenon wasn't just about people moving. It was about an idea moving. An idea so powerful it united a continent. So what was this idea? It was a package deal, a complete lifestyle kit. Along with the iconic beaker pot, this kit included copper daggers, stone wrist guards used for archery, and gold ornaments. These weren't just random objects. They were symbols. Symbols of a new identity, a new way of life centered around individual status, long-distance trade, and a shared set of beliefs and rituals. Think about the beaker itself. It was likely used for drinking a special beverage, maybe mead or an early form of beer. Sharing this drink wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was a social act, a ritual that brought people together. Picture a feast, where individuals from different communities gather. They'd pass around these special beakers, sharing a drink, forging bonds, and participating in a shared ceremony. By taking part, they weren't just joining a party. They were joining a club. They were becoming beaker people. This is where it gets really interesting. Genetic studies have shown a mixed picture. In some areas like Britain, there was a massive population replacement. Newcomers carrying beaker culture arrived and largely replaced the Neolithic people who built Stonehenge. But in other places like Central Europe, the local populations adopted the beaker package without a huge influx of new people. The DNA stayed largely the same, but the culture completely transformed. This tells us something profound. The Bell-Beaker identity wasn't strictly about ancestry or bloodline. It was something you could choose to become. You could adopt the fashion, learn the rituals, and use the tools. By doing so, you gain access to a vast network that stretched across Europe. This network offered new trade opportunities, new technologies like metalworking, and a new social standing. It was an exclusive, high-status identity, and everyone wanted in. In a way, the Bell-Beaker culture acted like a modern brand. Think about your favorite brand of smartphone or sneakers. It's more than just a product, right? It's a symbol of a certain lifestyle, a community of users, a sense of belonging. The Beaker package was the Bronze Age equivalent. It was a powerful brand that spread organically, without any king or emperor forcing it on people. It spread because it offered value, status, and connection. This voluntary adoption is key. It shows that people weren't just passive recipients of culture. They were active agents, making choices about their identity. A local farmer in what is now Germany could see the advantages of this new Beaker way of life. He could learn to make the distinctive pots, acquire a copper dagger, and participate in the drinking ceremonies. In doing so, he and his community became part of this European-wide phenomenon, connecting them to distant people and new ideas. This process fundamentally reshaped European society. The Beaker phenomenon laid the social and genetic foundations for much of Bronze Age Europe. The emphasis on individual wealth and status, represented by the grave goods buried with the dead, was a major shift from the more communal societies of the Neolithic period. The warrior-archer identity, symbolized by the dagger and wrist guard, became a new ideal. These were the cultural seeds from which later European societies would grow. So, what does a 4,500-year-old pot tell us about being human? It tells us that we are creatures of meaning. We don't just exist, we seek to belong. We build our identities through shared symbols, rituals, and stories. We form communities not just based on who our parents are, but on what we believe and how we choose to live. The Bell-Beaker people weren't a monolithic race. They were a diverse collection of individuals and communities, all drawn together by a shared cultural idea. They were connected by a brand, a ritual, a way of being that transcended geography and genetics. They chose to be part of something bigger than themselves. This desire for connection, for a shared identity built on more than just proximity, is a fundamental part of the human experience. We see it today in our global communities, our subcultures, our online tribes. We are constantly creating and adopting new Beaker packages, sets of symbols, behaviors, and beliefs that define who we are and connect us to others. The story of the Bell-Beaker culture is a powerful reminder that culture is not just something that happens to us. It's something we create, something we choose, and something that, in turn, shapes the very course of human history. It's a testament to our enduring need to find meaning and belonging, a need that echoes across the millennia, from a Bronze Age feast to the world we live in today. So the next time you see an ancient pot in a museum, remember the Bell-Beaker. It's not just a piece of clay. It's a symbol of a continental network, a social revolution, and a timeless human truth. Our identities are not just given, they are made. And in that making, we find our shared humanity. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Let me know in the comments what you think the Beaker package of our time is. See you in the next one.